The novel Outbound Flight by Timothy Zahn establishes that Palpatine knew the extragalactic Yuuzhan Vong, who invaded the galaxy in 25 ABY, posed a threat to the empire he was planning to create. And this sometimes even gets extended into the idea that the Death Star was an anti-Vong weapon. I've done a whole separate video in the past about how Palpatine knowing about the Vong doesn't actually mean the Empire was created for the explicit purpose of defeating the Vong, and where I talk about several of the reasons Palpatine contributed to the difficulty the galaxy faced in fighting off the Yuuzhan Vong. I'll link to that in the description, and I'll try not to retread too much ground here. Today I'm going to be focusing specifically on the idea of the Death Star as an example of dedicated anti-Vong engineering, because the Death Star is honestly an atrocious weapon to use against the Yuuzhan Vong. One of the things which I think is most interesting about the Yuuzhan Vong War, occurring as it does over about 5 years and 19 full-length novels, along with a variety of short stories, is that there's significant technological and tactical progression on both sides as they come to understand each other. We're all fairly familiar with the Star Wars galaxy's lasers and shields and such, but the Yuuzhan Vong used entirely different sets of weaponry and defensive measures. Every bit of Yuuzhan Vong technology, though they would object to the use of the word technology, relies on living beings fulfilling different purposes. Their ships are alive and grown out of coral, and then they fire superheated rocks, mostly in plasma form, out of volcano-like protrusions instead of just shooting lasers. This goes all the way down to individual items of clothing being alive, melee weapons being things like solid snakes, literally, snakes that become firm or limp to act as either whips or staffs, their ranged weapons being bugs that they throw, and so on. Most importantly for this Death Star discussion, the shields used by the Yuuzhan Vong are also not traditional shields. Instead, they're essentially localized black holes, able to absorb incoming matter and energy, controlled by creatures called Dovin basils. Dovin basils primarily operate by manipulating gravity, meaning they're in charge of not just the defensive measures on ships, but also propulsion, both local and in the Yuuzhan Vong version of hyperspace travel. They would lock onto a gravity well and basically pull the ship along towards it. This meant a Yuuzhan Vong ship's ability to move and defend itself had a negative correlation. Each vessel would only have a certain number of Dovin basils active, and therefore if they were focused on moving quickly, they would be less capable of intercepting incoming projectiles and vice versa. The ability to intercept incoming projectiles would also be limited to the number of Dovin basils on the ship, since each little black hole can only cover so large of an area, and they could only be created so close to the ship safely. There was, for example, a battle early on in the Yuuzhan Vong War where Luke was able to fold the Yuuzhan Vong command vehicle into its own black hole defenses, so it could be a double-edged sword and there were limitations, unlike liking this video and subscribing for more. This meant that over the course of the war, a lot of the New Republic and then Imperial efforts to overcome Vong defenses involved trying to trick the Dovin basils. If you had a standard firing solution against regular shields, you would typically want to zero in all of your hits on the point of impact. So, like with an X-Wing's 4 lasers, you'd typically want to localize where they impact as much as possible, so you could overload the shields in one area or put as much stress on the hull in one specific area as possible. So if you had a specific amount of energy you could output, focusing on one spot for a hull or a shield would mean you're more likely to go through than if you were to take the same amount of energy and distribute it equally around the entire shield or hull. With a Dovin basil, the opposite was essentially true. Dovin basil's limitations were rarely based on how much energy they could absorb, and their limitation was instead how much of the ship they could protect. So when fighting Yuuzhan Vong Coral Skippers, their version of snub fighters, X-Wings started offsetting their lasers, making each of the 4 shots hit at a slightly different angle, rather than giving one front, where a single Dovin basil could intercept all 4 shots. Imperial TIE fighters with fewer lasers used this information on Dovin basils provided by the New Republic to mimic the X-Wings by working in pairs, spreading out the impact of their fire to overload the Dovin basils in terms of coverage rather than sheer power. Simply increasing the amount of power you're putting out doesn't really do anything against a Dovin basil. So you may be starting to see where this is going with the Death Star. Because there was such an emphasis on tricking the Dovin basils rather than overloading them with sheer firepower, They would also resort to essentially stutter firing lower power blanks or tracer shots mixed in with full power shots, trying to rapidly saturate an area around a ship, making the Dovin basals have to choose which areas to cover, and thereby allowing some of the full power shots through to damage the Yorick coral hulls. The higher volume of lower power shots were far more effective as a weapon against the Yuuzhan Vong. There were similar issues with physical munitions, where if you send one giant bomb at a target, the Dovin basal would just eat the bomb, and then the bomb wouldn't do anything. Therefore, the New Republic tried a few different tactics to defeat them. One were Jedi Shadow Bombs, where Jedi pilots would propel munitions with the Force instead of with traditional propulsion methods, making them harder for the Yuuzhan Vong to detect and allowing more of the bombs to slip through. This obviously relied on one of a few Jedi in the galaxy to be present, so one of the other things the New Republic or the Imperials could do was simply detonate a physical munition before it got in range of the Dovin basal. This wasn't as effective as just directly detonating the bomb on an enemy hull, but it would be more likely to have some impact, and a lot of the Force would still make it around Dovin basal defenses. So the key point is that shields were more overloadable, but more distributable. Dovin basals were able to essentially negate all damage from one direction, but were more limited in coverage. And this is why the argument that the Death Star was some specific anti-Vong weapon doesn't really hold any water. The Death Star's super laser is nothing if not a single directional source of very telegraphed damage, which is exactly what the Yuuzhan Vong want to fight, compared to what you could get out of the same amount of resources put into a fleet of smaller warships able to distribute that fire more dynamically. Now, maybe you're a fan of the Enemy Lines duology by Aaron Alston, two of the books in the New Jedi Order series, and you're thinking, but Corey, you're wrong. In that duology, the New Republic makes a fake super laser with Project Starlancer, and the Yuuzhan Vong are afraid it would be able to destroy a world ship. Doesn't that mean the Vong are afraid of super lasers and that therefore they would probably be effective? I still think the answer is no because of some particular elements of how Starlancer worked. If you haven't read Enemy Lines, the New Republic basically made a system called Project Starlancer where a few starfighters would arrange themselves around a central fighter which held a massive focusing crystal called a lambent, something of Yuuzhan Vong origin. The fighters would then focus their energy through the lambent and fire a super laser across significant portions of galactic space. This project was built in the Borleus or Pyria system and then fired at the Coruscant system, and the test shot that was fired was able to do some damage to a world ship. The fear the Yuuzhan Vong had was that with some refinement, the laser would be powerful enough to have destroyed the world ship, not just damaged it a little bit. The upshot of all this was that Starlancer was actually fake, the beam from the fighters didn't actually really do anything, and the shot which hit the world ship was actually a normal turbolaser blast fired from within the Coruscant system by another hidden vessel. That doesn't change the fact that the Vong were afraid of the super laser, so let's just assume Starlancer worked and it wasn't just Wedge trying to bait the Yuuzhan Vong into attacking a particular part of the Borleus system. The big difference here between a Death Star and a version of Starlancer which actually works is essentially the element of surprise. If the Death Star's super laser could bypass the world ship's Dovin basals, it could certainly destroy a world ship. If you can be attacked at any moment from several systems away, this becomes much easier. You don't know where you're looking towards to protect. The Dovin basals are living creatures, they have to respond to some sort of stimulus that they know is coming. And even just on regular ships, they don't run their shields or other systems at all times, so the same thing can happen where a ship gets attacked with its shields down. If a world ship is just sitting or moving within a system thinking they're safe, the Dovin basals aren't going to be tracking for incoming super lasers and won't be able to activate in time. In the quote-unquote test firing of the Starlancer with the hidden ship, it was the ship's hidden nature which let it hit, not some special properties of a super laser. While the firing is happening, the world ship is able to bring up its Dovin basals and intercept part of the shot, but if it was a super laser firing at it that could actually destroy the ship, it probably would have been too late to really stop anything. But the Death Star was not able to fire from that far away. The Death Star is incapable of a surprise attack. It's very large. It needs to be in system, and the world ship would know it's there. The Death Star was developed as a weapon of terror, and terror usually involves being present. It was not a surprise weapon. There were other Imperial superweapons which were able to hit from systems away, like the Galaxy Gun, but even then, a giant missile coming out of hyperspace would be able to be detected and then probably intercepted in a similar way. So while it is true that stopping the Vong could have been part of Palpatine's goals with an established empire, I don't think it's why he established the empire, I also don't think we can point to the Death Star as an example of anti-Vong engineering. After all, the people who designed and advocated for it, then built it, were also certainly not doing so with any Vong-destroying purposes in mind either, given that Palpatine told so few people about them, and Tarkin was a big force behind pushing the Death Star forward. This was a weapon of home-focused terror, pure and simple, and if Palpatine did support it because he thought it was a good way to beat the Vong, he was unfortunately stupid. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.